It was March of 1967, in the flat forest northwest of Saigon. On the maps it was a province like any other. On the ground it was something else, a stretch of jungle and scrub the other side had held, quietly and almost without interruption for 20 years. The Americans called it War Zone C. That spring they threw the largest operation of the war so far around its edges. A great horseshoe of battalions closing on the border, and waited for something to be caught inside it. Almost nothing was. The men who lived in that forest did not stand still to be surrounded. They walked out through the gaps, and then they began coming to the American firebases instead, one after another, at night. On the 19th of March, helicopters set down in a small egg-shaped clearing near the middle of the zone. Charges went off among them as they touched the grass. Later, walking the ground, the men found 21 more shells still in place, most of them wired back to hiding spots in the tree line. The clearing had been made ready for them before they ever saw it. They built their base there anyway, about 450 men, and a battalion of guns whose whole purpose was to fire for somebody else, far away and out of sight. 2 mornings later, the guns had to fire at what was standing in front of them. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. Videos like this one take weeks to research and build from the archival record, and that one small click genuinely keeps the watch going. Now, get comfortable. Let the last helicopter of the evening fade off toward the south. Let the tree line go soft and then dark, and let's go back to the beginning, to a forest that had not belonged to anyone in Saigon for 20 years. War Zone C was a rectangle on an American map. 80 kilometers across and 50 deep, it was bounded on the west and the north by Cambodia, on the east by Highway 13, and on the south by a line drawn through Ben Cot and Tay Ninh. It lay northwest of Saigon, against the frontier. Inside the rectangle, the map had very little to say. 2 of those 4 sides were an international boundary. That single fact set the terms for everything else. Whoever lived in the zone always had one direction from which nobody would come, and it was the direction his supplies came from. Cambodia was not a feature of the ground. It was a line at which American units stopped. On paper, the area was the northern part of Tay Ninh province. The southern part was something else entirely, one of the most secure districts in the whole 3rd Corps zone, kept that way by the strong presence of the Kozai, a religious sect with its own quarrel with the communists. 1 province, 2 arrangements, and the forest lay in the north. 20 years is the figure the official history uses. A sanctuary for insurgents, it says, for over 20 years. That counts back past the American War into the French one. Nothing in that forest was new in 1967. The tracks were old, and the clearings were old, and so were the arrangements for keeping strangers out of them. Somewhere inside was an office. The central office for South Vietnam tied the parts of the insurgency together, military and civil, and everything in the South answered to its direction. That is close to the whole of what was known. Because of the remoteness of the area and the secrecy kept around that headquarters, few facts were held about its installations and units. An address without a street. For planning, the zone was cut into 3 sectors along 2 roads running north and south. The western strip lay against the border, and its upper corner was called the elephant's ear, or else the dog's head, after the shape the frontier makes when it is drawn. The The middle strip was where the headquarters was thought to sit. Ground in the district is undramatic. In the north and east it rises to about 150 meters. Flat marshy country in the west gives way to gently rolling ground, then to broken ground near the eastern edge of the province. Across 80 kilometers by 50, the staff studies found two features worth naming. One of them is a mountain. Nui Ba Den stands by itself in the middle of a rice plain, a little under 1,000 meters, some 3,000 feet above everything around it, and it rose, in one account, as if by mistake. The Americans called it the Black Virgin Mountain. Open fields lie at its foot, so it can be seen from most of the plain. It sits on the southern rim, and the operation went north of it. The other feature is a ridge, Nui Ong, Nui Kua Kong, and Nui Ta La, running as one continuous line. Everything else is level. Two rivers drain the area, the Vam Ko Dong in the west and the headwaters of the Saigon in the east, and neither of them can be forded. The smaller streams lie mostly in the east, and the principal ones have steep banks and muddy bottoms. Vegetation ran the whole range: dense forest, light forest, brushwood, bamboo thickets. The broadleaf evergreens made a single canopy, and in places a double one, and beneath them grew low trees, shrubs, more bamboo, and vines. Here and there the canopy broke. Here and there stood woodland that had been blighted by defoliants. Mostly the forest was closed over the top and closed at eye level too. Speed is the number that tells the rest. In dense jungle, tracked vehicles managed 1 kilometer an hour or less, which is the pace of a man walking slowly. Movement on foot was fair at best, and wheeled traffic was largely restricted to roads, of which there were not many. Sight lines followed the vegetation rather than the height of the ground. In rice and grassland a man could see a long way. In closed forest he could not, and fields of fire were extremely limited. Forest gave good concealment from the air and from the ground alike, and bamboo gave it from the ground. To anyone already living there, none of this was difficulty. It was cover. Paved road came to 1 or 2 stretches in the entire area, depending on which staff wrote the paragraph. Everything else was dirt and trail. Route 4 ran up the middle, and to secure it meant holding some 45 kilometers of graded earth as a line of communication. The northern road, Route 246, is described in the operational history as nothing more than a cart trail. Highway 13, the hard-surfaced one, was the eastern boundary and not a road of the zone at all. It is the main north-south artery linking Saigon to the northern part of the core area, and it runs outside. By the time the operation opened, all significant bridges in the area had been destroyed. Footbridges the enemy had built along his trails were still standing. Diggings were everywhere. Bunkers, foxholes, trenches, tunnels, positions cut for crew-served weapons, and several fortified areas large enough to hold a battalion. Some bunkers were made of concrete. The staff read that plainly as an indication of intended long-term use, and concrete had to be carried in over the trails. Level open ground in War Zone C was not found. It was made. Engineers spent 27 days building an airstrip near the mountain. 2 days after finishing it, they were at the northern edge, and inside 8 days, they had cleared 680,000 square feet of jungle and graded, drained, and rolled a second strip. Along Route 4, they cut the trees back from the shoulders. A handful of names holds the map together. Tay Ninh, the third largest city in South Vietnam, stands at the southern corner. Dau Tieng lies east by the Michelin. Suoi Da sits in the shadow of the mountain. Khartoum at the top, near the border. Prek Klok on the road between them. And on Route 4, 10 kilometers north of the mountain, there was an old French fort, which the artillery used as a base. Late in February, a camp was opened 3 kilometers from the Cambodian line. It had mess halls, lecture rooms, and supply depots, with living quarters dug in below ground and cooking places above, roofed in leaves so that nothing showed through the canopy. In one of the kitchens, a calendar pad was nailed to a roof support. The date left showing was the 23rd of February. In May of 1966, one American battalion was set down on the Cambodian border in the north of the zone. A brigade meant to follow it in that day. The rainy season arrived a fortnight early. The weather closed. The rest of the brigade could not be flown up, and the battalion was pulled out because it could not be reinforced. The attempt was called Birmingham. Later that year, the theater commander told the corps commander to plan another operation into the same forest, to open after the Christmas and New Year's stand-downs. It was to run on more than one division, and it was to include an airborne drop. The instruction, as the corps commander recorded it, was in effect to think big. The parachute jump was in the assignment from the first day. 3 objectives went into the plan: to engage the 9th Viet Cong Division and the North Vietnamese Regiment attached to it, to destroy the headquarters of the Central Office for South Vietnam, and to destroy the base camps and installations of the area. A 4th objective was not written into the mission paragraph: to convince the enemy that War Zone C was no longer a haven. The plan had a name before it had a date, and then it lost the name. In December, the staff concluded that Gadsden had been compromised, and the main effort was renamed Junction City. Gadsden was not discarded. It was moved sideways onto one of the 2 deception operations, so the burned name went on working as bait. Security was tight from the opening conference. The planning group inside Corps headquarters was held to a minimum, and where it was possible, preparations were made without being identified with the operation at all. Cedar Falls pushed the whole schedule back into late February. Deception ordinarily draws the enemy away from the ground in question. This one was built to do the reverse. Gadsden went in on the far western side with 1 division, Tucson 80 kilometers east with another, and the hope was that the 2 together would move the Viet Cong regiments inward. Rather than lead enemy units away from the target area, as before, the Corps commander hoped these preliminary affairs would drive them into it. By mid-January, the picture had changed. 1 regiment lay on the border in the west. The 2nd had moved to the Michelin northeast of Dau Tieng. The 3rd was outside the zone entirely. The area of primary interest shifted west. Corps intelligence also set down 5 things it expected of the enemy: fight a guerrilla war, attack in strengths of less than a regiment, withdraw in front of major forces, guard his base areas, and attack selected targets with forces of regimental strength at a time and place of his own choosing. The list was written before any of it started. The operational history records that the following 2 months validated it. Horseshoe is the word the plan used. Phase 1 would open on the 22nd of February, with 5 American brigades forming a cordon across the western half of the zone. 1 division blocking on the west along the border, the other holding the north along the frontier and the east along Route 4. The next day, a brigade and an armored cavalry regiment would come up through the open southern end. 60 kilometers is the figure for that perimeter. The western leg ran north of Tay Ninh to the border. The top followed the cart trail east along the frontier. The eastern leg came down past Khartoum. 60 kilometers of cordon in forest where a man on foot saw nothing past the undergrowth. For that perimeter, the operation was written on as many as 22 American infantry battalions, 14 artillery battalions, some 25,000 men in all. What stood around the horseshoe on the opening day was 18 battalions, 6 brigades, and a cavalry regiment. Another account of the same day counts 20. 13 mutually supporting fire support bases ringed the area. It was the largest operation of the war to date. Every source keeps the tail on that sentence. And the tail is the interesting part. The same phrase had been used 4 months earlier for Attleboro, and again in January for Cedar Falls. 3 operations in a row, each of them the largest at the moment it happened. 9 infantry battalions went in by air on the opening day, 8 by helicopter, 1 by parachute to close the northern rim. The ground columns had started rolling at 6:30 that morning, with the artillery riding inside them and set down along the route. Each battery left at the spot where its fire base was to be. The jump had an arithmetic reason. Helicopters were the scarce thing, and a staff study showed that putting 1 battalion task force in by parachute would save 60 helicopters for 2.5 hours. That decided it. The official history adds the other half plainly. It also suited 2 commanders who were paratroopers. Hiding the landing place took more work than the landing. A false drop zone was designated 25 kilometers east of the real one and written into the operation orders of both headquarters, so that the deception lived inside the genuine paperwork. 4 officers knew at the start. The signal officer was told 2 days ahead, and the men on the afternoon before, with their area sealed behind them. After an hour and 40 minutes of preparation from the air, 13 transports came over a savanna a few kilometers north of Khartoum. The zone took some 26 seconds to cross, which is why there were 2 passes, 15 men to a stick. The brigade commander went out the right-hand door first. Within 10 minutes, all 845 men were on the ground, and the day cost 11 minor injuries. Among them was a warrant officer of 53, on his 5th combat jump in 20 years. The 4 before were in Sicily, at Salerno, and in Normandy at night. An artillery battery jumped with the infantry that morning. The whole battery, its howitzers dropped in behind it by the transports. It was the first American combat parachute assault since Korea, as it turned out, the only American parachute assault of this war. Then the horseshoe closed on nothing. Between the 22nd and the 27th of February, some 35,000 Americans went over the center of War Zone C as thoroughly as they could, and the official history gives the result in one word: unimpressive. 5 days of campaigning, it says, and the Corps appeared to have conducted the largest non-battle of the war. The shoe had been pitched well. The stake was not there. Base camps turned up in quantity, most recently used. Nearly all sewn with booby traps, many of those inert, because whoever laid them had not connected the wires. The bunkers were well built and roofed against anything falling from above. Yet few sites were fortified for defense, which suggested the builders had never meant to hold them. In one bunker north of Khartoum, under a steel roof, was a photographic laboratory with rolls of developed film and hundreds of prints. Phase 1 ended at midnight on the 17th of March. Phase 2 carried the weight of the operation into the eastern half of the zone, where the Saigon River was to be bridged. Units had begun shifting east as early as the 4th of the month. Behind them, the cordon came apart, and the western half of the zone was left to itself. In the last days of December 1964, a Viet Cong division took a Catholic village east of Saigon, called Bin Za, and held it. 2 South Vietnamese battalions were sent against the village and were destroyed there. The division was the 9th, and Bin Za was where its name begins to mean something in American files. The enemy read the fight as the beginning of the final mobile phase of the war. The South Vietnamese read it as a challenge they could not meet alone. Underneath both readings was a change of scale. Viet Cong battalions were growing into regiments, and regiments into divisions. The 9th was a product of that growth, raised in the South rather than sent down to it. At the end of the following year, one of its regiments overran a South Vietnamese regiment. In the summer after that, the division came off much worse, broke off a long fight on the eastern side of War Zone C, and withdrew into the sanctuaries along the Cambodian border. Then it did what it had done before. It retrained, re-equipped, and absorbed replacements, where nobody was going to interrupt the work. In late October of 1966, it moved its 3 regiments, and a North Vietnamese regiment lent to it, into the middle of Tay Ninh province. 1 regiment would attack a special forces camp at Suoi Tre. The others would lie along the routes the relieving force had to take. A division that worked this way was not something an army found. It arrived at a place and an hour of its own choosing and then was not there anymore. Most of what the Americans knew about it came from documents, from prisoners, and from the shape of ground it had already left. 3 regiments made up the division, their numbers running in sequence. The 271st, the 272nd, the 273rd. American charts that winter did not entirely agree about who belonged to whom, and one of them put the 3rd Regiment directly under the headquarters that ran the war in the South. The regiments were not interchangeable. The 271st was rated the most capable main force regiment the enemy had in the region. The 273rd had gone east and took no part in what happened in the zone. The borrowed North Vietnamese regiment did not know the terrain of War Zone C, which was the one thing the division's own regiments had in common. 2 weeks before the operation began, a periodic intelligence report went out from Corps listing where each formation was believed to be. Against the 272nd, the entry read, "South of Suoi Tre and west of the Saigon River." The name was already on the map as a reference point, months before anyone cut a clearing near it. By the standards of the Corps, that regiment stood high. American reporting called it one of the best organized and best equipped units the enemy had, and one of the few Viet Cong units that dared to make attacks in daylight. Commanders considered it the most reliable regiment in the division, which meant it could be given work the others could not. Headquarters used it accordingly. When part of the military staff needed to get clear of an area the Americans were searching, the regiment was directed to attack elsewhere and draw attention away. And it did. When it broke off a fight and pulled back through the forest, observers noted that it kept its discipline in retreat, which is the harder half. With the regiment came artillery. The record gives it a designation and little else. U-80, an element attached to the 272nd and supporting its attacks with heavy mortars, the heaviest the enemy had yet brought into this war. Behind those were towed guns that outranged the howitzers standing on the American firebases. Everywhere the division lived, it dug. Bunkers of all descriptions were found across the base areas, most of them fighting positions for 1 or 2 men, a great many with overhead cover. Between them ran communication trenches. Storage bunkers held rice and arms. The camp sat near streams or near roads, close to the ways things moved, by rule and not by accident. Above all this stood an office rather than a general staff. The regional committee directing the war in the southern half of the country was called, in American shorthand, the Central Office for South Vietnam, and everything communist in the South answered to it. Almost nothing was known about it in detail, given the remoteness of the ground and the secrecy kept around it. Its strength was put at 3,000 spread through the northern part of the zone in the usual mix of signals, transport, and supply. But the command cell itself was believed to be 50 or 70 people, highly mobile, whose practice when threatened was to go into the ground or cross into Cambodia. That was the target the operation had been designed around. Underneath it, the zone ran closer to an administration than a garrison. Printing presses and a photographic laboratory, typewriters and code books, a training regiment in the west. Rear service groups numbered like departments, fed from depots across the border. Rice was the visible half of it, and rice was buried. One thing men learned by accident: when a cache was uncovered, a flock of small birds went up off the ground above it. After that, whenever a flock went up for no reason, somebody walked over and looked at what was underneath. When the operation closed its ring on the center of the zone, 35,000 Americans spent 5 days going over that ground as thoroughly as they could. The results were unimpressive. One historian calls it the largest non-battle of the war. The headquarters was not caught, and it was never established that it had been inside the ring at all. What they found instead was base camps in quantity, nearly all recently used, nearly all fitted with booby traps, a good number of them inert, because whoever built them had never connected the wires. The bunkers were well made and carried substantial overhead cover. Very few were fortified. Nobody had intended to defend them. 3 reasons went into the official account afterward. A privileged sanctuary lay a short distance from where the headquarters was thought to be. There were not enough troops available to seal infiltration routes through jungle, that thick against men who knew it, and the movement of units and supplies beforehand had shown what was coming. Behind all 3 lay a plainer sentence, written later by the general who commanded the field force. It was a physical impossibility to keep this enemy from slipping away whenever he wished. In country he knew, the jungle was too thick and too widespread. The option to fight was usually his, none of which meant indifference. The headquarters did not take the invasion of its base area lightly, and orders went out within days. The North Vietnamese regiment was to come down out of the border salient and ambush convoys on the road, supplying the operation. The 272nd, refitting in the same salient, was given the same task, and a 3rd regiment was to move west against traffic on the highway east of the zone. Light infantry against supply lines promised at least some local success and might pull American attention away from what the operation had come to do. The regiments took the orders and started walking. The horseshoe had been pitched at a stake that was not there, and the men it was meant to catch were going out around the open end of it. Everything the first phase of the operation did rested on a road. 45 kilometers of it ran north from Tay Ninh toward the border, and one division had the job of keeping that stretch open and covering the engineers building along it. The horseshoe itself was 60 kilometers around, and the top of it was a cart trail. Covering a road meant fire bases, artillery set down at intervals, dug in, wired, and left standing. It was what the operation needed, and also the one thing in the jungle that did not move. A base can be found once and visited later, at an hour chosen by the visitor. Prek Klok was a stream and a point on the road, 20 kilometers north of the mountain over the plain. By the last week of February, an artillery base stood there, with an infantry battalion on the perimeter, 2 batteries inside, and engineers at work on a camp and an airstrip within the same wire. It was a construction site with guns in it. On the morning of the 28th, a rifle company left its night position beside the road and moved east to search. 2,500 meters ahead was the stream the place was named for, and the company never reached it. The jungle had thinned. The obstacle now was deadfall, a tangle across the line of march every 50 or 75 meters. They went at it in cloverleaf, the lead platoon swinging out and back. At 10:30, the head of the column took fire. The commander was told his men had seen 3 machine guns. And from 3 machine guns he read something much larger in front of him. Whether that was an ambush or a collision is a place where the record does not agree with itself. All of it agrees the enemy was concealed and not dug in, and so not ready for what followed. Artillery had been walking ahead of the company since it left the road, so nothing had to be started from nothing, and air came in on a cycle of 15 minutes. Because the enemy was above ground rather than under it, what was asked for came in almost at treetop level, laid in relation to colored smoke, inside 30 yards of the smoke, run after run. Much of what came back came from the trees, and it was accurate. By 3 in the afternoon, the contact was broken. The prisoner taken next morning was the deputy commander of a company in the North Vietnamese regiment, attached to the 9th Division, and his battalion had been on its way to the road and to a convoy. That is what February looked like. The thing being hunted was traffic. 10 days later, at the same place on the same road, that changed. The base was held by a mechanized battalion and held in a circle. Carriers at 50-meter intervals, the ground between them covered by foxholes that infantry, engineers, and artillerymen manned together. The men called that shape a wagon train, and from the air that is what it was. Evening on such a base had a routine. At last light, everything on the perimeter fired outward at once, the mad minute, partly to test weapons and partly to say what was there. Ambush parties and listening posts went into the dark. At 8:30, a post east of the wire reported 3 men and fired at them, and the battalion went to 3/4 alert. At 10 o'clock, the mortars started and came down inside the base for half an hour. Counterfire was going out 2 minutes after the first burst, and the heavy mortar platoon fired 435 rounds before the night was over. When the shelling stopped, the battalion commander had every unit on the wire fire outward, into the belt from 200 to 600 meters, on the assumption that whatever was coming was already inside it. The reconnaissance had barely ended when the ground attack came out of the east, into the sector held by 1 company. The artillery answer had been arranged in advance. Defensive concentrations were registered in a ring around the perimeter before anybody needed them, fired the moment the first mortar round landed, then walked in toward the attack as it developed. Neighboring bases fired for this one too, so the guns working the wood line were not only its own. Overhead, the sky was divided by the road, declared a coordination line between the artillery and the aircraft. West of it, the shells, east of it, the bombs, neither waiting on the other. An armed transport circled through the night. Supply aircraft came in with their landing lights on and put sling loads down inside the wire. The main assault was broken in about an hour, and the last shot from outside came around 4:30. What had come at the base was afterward identified as the 272nd, with the same artillery element supporting it. On the size, the sources part company. One puts 2 battalions in the east, another a battalion in the east, and a company against the southwest. The reason, by one account, was errand work. Headquarters had ordered the regiment to attack there as a diversion, so that part of its military staff could get clear of ground the Americans were searching. When it broke off, it pulled back in order. What the Americans took from the night reads like a list of small mechanical facts. Get firepower onto an attacking force without delay. Use guns and aircraft at once, divided by a line. Keep quick-firing artillery within reach of any unit, whatever its size. Sight the bases so each can shoot for its neighbor. A second lesson ran alongside, and it concerned not perimeters, but landing grounds. The year before, a captured document had set out an intention to destroy an American battalion on a landing zone. Not on a base, on the patch of grass where the helicopters set it down. The document was 9 months old, and it had been read. Because of it, one battalion walked overland to occupy a clearing that was to become a firebase, rather than fly in, against the practice of its own division. After the place was secured, Rangers found batteries and a wire in the woodline. Following the wire, they came to 4 holes, a center hole and 3 on spokes 25 meters out, caps in each, and in the middle a load of shells and explosives set to be fired on command. Some 60 kilometers east by the highway that runs south toward Saigon, the same thing was tried against a base of the same kind. A cavalry troop loggered in a circle around a battery. It began with a herd of belled cattle driven across the road by the perimeter, then a heavy machine gun firing from an old railroad embankment, and hours later mortars and men coming out of the trees. Finding those mortars took radar from a base further off, and 2 artillery observers in the air who could see the flashes. The platoon lying in ambush north of the base came back down the highway shooting. Other platoons broke in through the fire, and the troop commander pushed his perimeter out 40 meters with a counterattack. By morning, the regiment had gone back east. In February, the thing worth hunting was a convoy on a road. By the time the operation shifted its weight into the eastern half of the zone, it was the place the road had been built to protect. The regiment that came out of the trees by the highway made no further attempt against it. Dau Tieng stood at the southern edge of War Zone C, where the forest ended and the rubber began. The Michelin plantation lay against the base, and the airstrip inside the wire had been staging helicopter lifts since the winter. In the dry season, its red dust got into tents, tarpaulins, food, and guns. An American brigade had lived there since the autumn of 1966. The brigade was called the 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division. Its division was nowhere near it. The 4th Infantry Division was fighting in the Central Highlands, in another corps zone, several hundred kilometers north, and the brigade had never served under it in Vietnam. It carried the number of a division it had not seen. This was not an accident of a busy season. In November of 1966, Westmoreland decided that the newly arrived brigade would be stationed at Dau Tieng under the control of the 25th Infantry Division. The record puts it flatly. The brigade would go to the 25th rather than to its parent unit in the Highlands, before it had fought anywhere. In the Highlands, the decision was felt as a subtraction. The general holding that country was left with 6 infantry battalions, a tank battalion, and a cavalry squadron. slightly less than a division, for a stretch of mountains he thought far too large for it. Around Saigon, the same decision read as an addition. 2 American infantry divisions covered the approaches to the capital. One had 3 combat brigades, and the other had 4, not a standard number for a division. The 4th was the brigade at Dau Tieng. Paperwork had a formula for it. In the first phase of Junction City, the 25th Division employed its own brigade together with other units under division control. The brigade from the 4th Division, a separate light infantry brigade, an armored cavalry regiment, 2 South Vietnamese battalions. One of those formations belonged to the division. The rest were lodgers. A month earlier, the same language produced a sentence that reads oddly now. Operation Gadsden, the record says, employed 2 brigades of the 25th Infantry Division, and neither brigade it names belonged to the 25th. In the usage of the time, a brigade of the 25th meant a brigade the 25th commanded. The Army settled the wording eventually, and that took until the following summer. On the 1st of August 1967, the 3rd Brigade of the 25th became the 3rd Brigade of the 4th. The brigade at Dau Tieng, which had been operating with the 25th since entering Vietnam, became the 3rd Brigade of the 25th. The tables were switched to match what had been true all along. Where a man could see the arrangement was on paper of another kind. The brigade's reports went up to the commanding general of the 25th Infantry Division. Letterhead at the top said 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division. The address line under it said 25th. Between the 2 lines there was no explanation because nobody working there needed one. Inside the brigade, the seam ran in one place. The mechanized infantry battalion belonged to the 25th Division, and so did its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Julian. The tanks came from higher up still, an armor battalion released by the Corps headquarters above both divisions. Men under 3 different chains of command were doing one brigade's work. On paper, the brigade held 5 maneuver units, 1 mechanized infantry battalion, 2 infantry battalions, a troop of cavalry, and a company of armor. Behind them stood an artillery battalion in direct support, its mission written in the flat language of the order: to support the maneuver battalions with on-call and immediate fire requests. Colonel Marshal Garth commanded the brigade. He had it through February on the Cambodian border, through the first phase of Junction City, and would keep it into the spring. Much of what is known about how the brigade was run comes from him directly. An Army historian sat down with him 9 years afterward. His infantry battalions were the 3rd of the 22nd under Lieutenant Colonel John Bender, and the 2nd of the 12th. Bender's battalion was short a company. The guns were the 2nd of the 77th, towed howitzers, and the man who commanded them does not appear the same way twice in the histories. That man was Lieutenant Colonel John Vesey. One volume calls him the battalion commander and leaves it there. Another says he was the deputy commander of the 25th Division's artillery, standing in at the head of a battalion not his own. Who its regular commander was, the records do not say. Dau Tieng itself had belonged to other people first. A separate light infantry brigade used it. Then it was a forward base of another division. Then it went to the brigade from the 4th. The field force kept a forward command post there through the winter and closed it on the 12th of March. For a base of that size, it was still unfinished. The semi-permanent aviation refueling point was not working that spring, so the brigade's fuel tanker had to stay at Dau Tieng instead of moving up. What the brigade had been doing before the middle of March was mostly walking and looking. In February, it worked 30 kilometers northwest of Tay Ninh, near the Cambodian border, in country that ran from rice paddy to triple canopy jungle, with grass standing 6 feet high. The fighting was small, and the enemy did not stand to be fought. Finds were larger than the fighting. There was a main force training area with an obstacle course and a land navigation course, warehouses of rice, and a workshop for making and storing bombs, artillery rounds, and grenades. The operation ran 20 days and ended on the 21st of February. Garth put a conclusion into the record when it closed. Godstone, he wrote, had proved that mechanized units could operate in heavily vegetated terrain, and that American forces had the ability to move at their own discretion. Inside War Zone C, it was a judgment about ground rather than about the enemy. When Junction City opened on the 22nd of February, the brigade did not move at all. It stayed where Gadsden had left it, in the far west of the operational area, and its positions became the broad left leg of the horseshoe. On the first day, it secured the western flank of the whole force and met only slight resistance. Through the first half of March, it held the highway and worked as an anvil. An armored cavalry regiment swept counterclockwise through the western forest to press whatever was in there back against the brigade's blocking positions. The sweep opened after heavy bomber strikes and met almost nothing. Camps turned up, one with 2 large printing presses standing in concrete bunkers, and the people who had used them were gone. On the 15th of March, the brigade came back to Dau Tieng. The senior American commanders were disappointed by then. The gains of that month had been meager, and the regiment they were hunting left no trace. The operations order for the next phase was signed on the 17th, the day after the brigade came in, and the changes to it followed as separate fragments, one a day. By that week, the brigade had been in the country 5 months. It had the number of a division in the Highlands, a headquarters that reported to another division's general, a battalion on loan, and a company of tanks from a corps. At Dau Tieng, the dry season went on. Dust over the tarpaulins, the airstrip working from first light, the fuel tanker standing where it had to stand. For the second phase of Junction City, the whole effort moved east. The bulk of the American force came out of the original horseshoe and into a box of roads. Route 4 on the west, Route 246 on the north, the highway to Saigon on the east. 3 brigades took up positions along those roads as a loose cordon. 3 more went inside the box to search the ground between them. 2 things stood behind the change. The first phase had not sealed the center of War Zone C, and the American command believed that enemy planners were alerted to its intentions. That was the judgment before the phase began, not a conclusion drawn afterward. Command in that country had just changed hands. The 25th Division had a new commander, a major general who took it over on the 6th of March, 12 days before the new phase opened. On the 12th, the field force commander closed his forward post at Dau Tieng and went back to his own headquarters, leaving 2 division commanders with 24 battalions between them and, as the history puts it, little idea of what they might encounter. The phase began on the 18th of March with a move by the brigade at Dau Tieng. Garth sent his mechanized battalion north to seize a clearing 25 kilometers away, chosen off a map as the first landing zone. The rest of the brigade would fly in the following morning. The fire support base would go up on ground already taken and held. There was more in the order than that. A reinforced mechanized company with an engineer platoon and a battery of guns would go overland from Dau Tieng. On the second day, the engineers were to put in a bridge, and a fire base was to be established at the bridge site itself. The water that bridge was meant to cross had a name in the order, the Suoi Tre. Beyond it, the armor was to cross and search westward. The column did not get that far. Mines slowed it first, then anti-tank rockets fired out of the trees. Mines in that country were laid at night by men who knew the ground, scattered through an area rather than set into belts, so that no line on a map could tell you where they were not. About 7 of every 10 vehicles lost in the theater were lost that way. It was a substitution, and the enemy made it deliberately. Where another army would have used artillery to close a road, this one used mines and booby traps, spread in no pattern at all, on a scale the Americans had not met before. Knowing that a mine could be anywhere slowed everything down, and that was as much the point as the damage. Then the column came to the stream. Its banks were too steep for the carriers. Not too deep and not too wide, too steep, and the vehicles could not get down one side and up the other. The stream itself was no surprise. It was named in the brigade's own order, and there was a bridge in the plan for it. What was not in the plan was the shape of the banks, so the mechanized battalion stopped west of the water, and the tanks stopped with it. The first clearing was not taken that day. The armor that was to have stood in the landing zone when the helicopters came in was on the far side of the water. Garth did not wait for the crossing. Rather than delay his main effort until the stream was forded, he sent the rest of the brigade to an alternate landing zone on the morning of the 19th, without the armored security. The airlift was the main effort, and the armor was its escort. The clearing they flew to was not the one that had been fought for, and the absence of the escort was named out loud in the decision itself. The alternate clearing was egg-shaped and small, near the center of War Zone C, 90 kilometers northwest of Saigon, with an abandoned hamlet called Suoi Tre beside it. Around it stood a tree line of thin woodland blighted by defoliants. 3 kilometers off lay ground where, 4 months earlier during Attleboro, an American battalion had fought elements of the 272nd Viet Cong regiment. Artillery worked the clearing for 30 minutes before anything came in. Then the helicopters descended into it, and charges buried in the ground went off among them. Heavy ones, fired by wire from outside the clearing at the moment when the machines were down and the men were still aboard. How many charges there were and which lifts they caught, the accounts do not agree. 3 helicopters were destroyed. That number is the one thing every account of the morning shares. Past it they diverge, on the machines damaged and on everything else. A Claymore-type mine was detonated against one of the rifle companies as well. Garth had a decision to make in the time it takes to say it. He did not call off the assault. There were already too many men on the ground for that. And the remaining lifts were ordered in on top of the ones already down. The reasoning was arithmetic rather than temper. Later that day, the brigade's other infantry battalion came into the same clearing, moved off to the northwest. The aviation battalion had refueled and regrouped between the 2 lifts. On the last flight out, fire came up from the tree line, and 7 more helicopters were damaged. When the clearing was searched, 21 unexploded shells were found in it. Most were wired for detonation from hiding places nearby. The brigade's own report describes buried wire running to concealed bunkers and charges at both ends of the landing zone. The shells had been carried in, placed, connected and left, and the wire that ran from them was buried. The report also says who had been in the clearing. The few enemy at this landing zone, it says, proved to be a caretaker force, not a covering party and not a garrison. Men posted to the charges and left there with them. The same document explains the practice of the standing arrangement rather than a local trick. Usually a small force guards the landing zone, it says, and is prepared to fire the charges. That is the whole system in one line. The ground is prepared in advance. Someone stays behind with it, and the wire runs back to where he waits. It was a job, and someone had been doing that job here. An army historian working through the brigade's papers long afterward set the two things side by side, the charges that went off under the helicopters and the shells the search turned up afterward. Then he wrote one flat sentence into his account of the morning. Clearly, the Americans had been expected. The brigade wrote its own note about mined landing zones when the operation was over. Many landing zones and likely landing zones, it observed, are prepared with command-detonated charges, from bombs down to claymores, and a small party stays to fire them. A heavy artillery preparation, it went on, frequently causes that party to leave or destroys the wires. On the 19th of March, the preparation had lasted half an hour. The note continued into procedure in 3 steps. Cut all the wires leading from the charges. Tie the cut wires together. Blow the charges in place. In the neighboring division, the lesson took a different form. From then on, when it put fire into a landing zone, it used bombs fused to burst on contact over the exact spots where the helicopters would touch down, enough to cut wire, and not enough to tear the ground up so badly that landing became difficult. None of that changed what was decided on the 19th. The shells had been counted, the wires had been followed back into the tree line, and the preparation of that ground was no longer in question. Garth built his fire support base on the landing zone. A fire base began as a piece of ground with a stake driven into the middle of it. An engineer's stake, ordinary wood, nothing to look at. Everything that followed was measured outward from that one point, and the work started early, because the deadline was not a clock. It was the light. Artillery did not stay behind the infantry in this war. It went where the infantry went, and when a battalion walked out past the reach of the guns had to be set down somewhere ahead. A fire base was that somewhere, built almost entirely for the artillery supporting one operation. A battery could not hold its own ground. It had neither the men for that nor the training, and once it was set down in a position chosen in advance, it could be attacked from any direction at all. So infantry came with it. The position the guns and their infantry occupied together was what the words fire base meant, and whichever of the two officers was senior commanded it. What the arrangement bought was direction. A battery inside a fire base could shoot anywhere out to its full range, where ordinary gun positions were laid to face one way. Where to put it was decided by both commanders together. Soil firm enough to hold the howitzers, ground that could be supplied from the air, other artillery within reach. The guns themselves stood in a pattern about as deep as it was wide, so the shape of the bursts on the ground came out right without correction. 6 guns stood in a star, 5 at the points, and the 6th in the middle. The star did 2 jobs at once, an even spread of fire, and defense facing every way. At night, the centerpiece could work illumination while the other 5 worked their targets. The layout was struck out with a rope. From the center stake, a line was run outward and swung around, and where it traveled was where the bunkers would sit. An aiming circle went up at the center. From it, the first bunker was marked, then a peg every 15 degrees the whole way round. That gave 24 positions, the number settled on as right for a company. To each peg a helicopter brought the same package: one shaped demolition charge, 2 sheets of pierced steel planking, a bundle of empty sandbags. The charge blew the first hole. The crater was squared up by hand. The planking and the filled bags made the rest, and out of it came a bunker 9 feet across. Heavy work inside the perimeter belonged to a bulldozer, which came in the way everything came in. Engineer machines were redesigned to break down into 2 helicopter loads and go back together on the ground. The dozer dug the pits for the command bunkers and pushed up the berms the guns sat behind. None of this was doctrine. There could be no standard way to occupy such a position, with the ground different every time. The steps came from the men doing the work and were written down only years later. However long it took, the company holding the base was dug in with complete overhead cover by nightfall of the first day. The infantry set its perimeter as tight around the guns as could be managed. A perfect circle was what everyone wanted and almost nobody got, because the terrain being defended was never the right shape. Positions on the line were dug in and bunkered where there was time and material for it, with full overhead cover, and their fires were laid to interlock all the way round. In front of the line went the wire, a row of triple concertina, coils stacked on coils, and the strip between the wire and the bunkers was laced with claymores and trip flares. A claymore weighed 3.5 pounds and covered a man's height out to 50 meters. What mattered about it was that it could be aimed. In a position meant to be held, they were laid in depth, each zone overlapping the next. What held the line was mostly what the men carried, with the mortars behind it, valued for the high explosive they put out and for the light they put up. An air defense weapon on the perimeter was luck. There were 2, a tracked mount carrying twin automatic cannon and another carrying 4 heavy machine guns that fired together. Neither had been designed to shoot at the ground, and both were formidable at it, and there were never enough to go around. Inside the infantry line there was a second line. Fighting holes were dug close around the howitzers and the fire direction bunkers, and then left empty, with nobody standing in them. The inner perimeter existed so that gunners would have somewhere to fight from if the base were attacked on the ground, and so that nobody would be digging it at the time. The gun pit was built to a pattern each battalion set for itself, and it delivered the same things every time. Cover for the piece and its crew all the way round. Overhead cover a man could reach up and touch. Protection for the ammunition. Sandbags, ammunition boxes, powder canisters, steel planking, heavy timbers, roofing sheet. Barrier material for one operation ran to nearly 1.5 million sandbags. Patrolling went on outside the wire continuously, and the reason given for it was not to find the enemy, but to keep him from reconnoitering the base and preparing an attack on it. A base holding 1 battery took a whole rifle company to defend. Just after dusk, the perimeter fired a mad minute, every weapon on the line at once, into the trees. It tested the weapons and made a show of force, and was meant as both. Then the ambush patrols went out through the wire to their positions in the jungle, and the listening posts went out after them, north and east and wherever else the ground needed watching. Through the night the guns did not rest either, placing harassment and interdiction fire around the perimeter at intervals, on nothing anyone had seen. Coming back in was the delicate part. A post returning at first light could be followed in, and more than once a post walked into its own trip flares. At Suoi Tre, the clearing was already there. Nobody cut it. It was an egg shape in thin woodland, and the perimeter had to take the shape the ground gave it. Company B of the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, was assigned the east portion. Company A took the western half. Work went on quickly through the 20th of March to improve the defenses of that perimeter. What the work consisted of was not written down anywhere. On any base, it was the same short list of things, and the list was never finished, only put down when the light went. The gun that did most of this war's work was not the biggest one. It was a towed howitzer of 105 millimeters, light enough to be lifted and set down anywhere, plain enough to be relied on, and quick. Those three things were why it went with light infantry, and why it answered when somebody needed a great many shells close in at once. 2 versions were in service that spring. The older had supported American troops since the Second World War and had hardly changed. 2.5 tons behind a truck, with a breech at a man's waist that made it easy to load. Its limitation was sideways. The carriage traversed only so far, and to point the barrel further round the crew, had to lift the trails and shift them bodily. The newer piece was lighter, lower, and turned the whole way round on its own mount. Older gunners did not want it. They liked the waist-high breech. They liked the clearance under the old carriage on tow, and the old gun cost less. Their arguments went nowhere. The changeover went on steadily, 1 battalion at a time. Distance was what either of them was built for. A howitzer is an instrument for putting a shell onto something the crew will never see, worked out on paper and laid off in angles. The heavier howitzer of that war reached 14,600 meters. The one standing on the fire bases reached some 3,000 meters short of that. Both are far past anything a man can make out through trees. A gun and the men serving it were a section, and the man in charge of it was the chief of section. The Fire Direction Center did the arithmetic and passed down the data. The sections laid the pieces and fed them. Nothing in that arrangement required anybody at a gun to look at the target, and ordinarily nobody did. Because a base could be attacked from any side, a gun had to be able to face any side, and fast. There are 6,400 mils in the full circle the way gunners measure angles, and they spoke of the 6,400 mil environment as a plain condition of the job. Sections kept 2 sets of aiming references instead of 1, and drove azimuth stakes in a ring around the piece, so that a new direction meant laying on a stake rather than working the whole problem again. The artillery's contribution to defending a base came in 3 kinds. There was direct fire, delivered by the base's own guns at what they could see. There was counter-mortar fire, planned in advance against the places a mortar was likely to be set up, unobserved, needing nobody to have seen anything. And there was mutually supporting fire. That third kind meant the guns of other bases, shooting at this one's perimeter from kilometers away, and it decided things most often. A firebase looks like an isolated point and is not one. Its heaviest argument is another battery, out of sight over the trees, laying shells along the outside of its wire. Direct fire means what the words say: a line of sight between the weapon and the target. The gunner looks at the thing he is shooting at. For field artillery, this is the exception and not the rule. It came with its own ammunition, its own drills, and sectors worked out beforehand alongside the infantry's plan, covering the likely approaches and the weak places, from which follows a requirement that sounds backwards, until it is thought through. The infantry bunkers on the perimeter had to be built up at the back, not toward the trees, toward the guns. A man in a hole on the line had his own battery behind him, and what protected him from an anti-personnel round fired over his position was the wall on the friendly side. That round was called Beehive. It was a shell filled with something over 8,000 flechettes, small steel darts finned like miniature arrows, and it did not behave like other shells. The fuse was set for muzzle action. The shell opened at the mouth of the barrel, and what came out went forward in a cone of about 30 degrees. It was new. The first one fired in combat went out in November of 1966 from a battery in another part of the country, and that single round ended the attack. A month later, at a firebase far to the north and east, 2 rounds stopped a night assault, and after that the field artillery believed in the shell. Believing in it did not make it ordinary. A battery commander could not simply decide to use Beehive. Permission was asked of the infantry commander whose men were on the line. It was not always given at once, and it could be held back until the last patrol outside the wire was in again. By the spring of '67, the round was trusted. It was not routine. There were things it could not do, and those were known too. The darts fly flat in that shallow cone, and a man lying down or crawling passes underneath. Where that happened, the answer was a different shell. High explosive with a time fuse burst above the ground, which worked where Beehive did not. And there were only ever so many. Beehive rounds came in on the same helicopters as everything else, and a base had what had been sent. The number was counted in tens, a couple of dozen, 3 dozen on a generous load, never in hundreds. When they were gone, and the gun stood there with ordinary shells stacked beside it. Tanks carried a shell in the same family with an older name. Canister, fired from a 90mm gun, is a container that comes apart at the muzzle. What it was for is best heard in the way it got asked for. One night at another perimeter, a crew with the enemy on top of their vehicle called to the track beside them and asked to be dusted with canister. The gunner hesitated. Then he was asked again. Canister runs out the way Beehive runs out. When the tanks in that action had fired theirs, they went to high explosive with a delayed fuse, put into the ground short, so that the shell skipped and burst above. Every special round has a bottom, and beneath it lies an ordinary round used in an unusual way. Nor were the tanks strangers to this ground. The previous December, the armored battalion working the road out of Tay Ninh had run them up and down it at night. 2 or 3 passes at uneven intervals, firing canister and machine guns into the verges where an ambush would lie. After 3 nights, the mining of that road stopped. With the special rounds gone, a howitzer fires what it has, level, at what is in front of it. Inside a battery doing that, 2 conversations run at once. The commander and the chiefs of section correcting their own fire by eye, and the fire direction officer on the radio, correcting somebody else's arriving from far away. So the instrument was 2 instruments. One reached past everything the crew could see and worked in tables and angles and other men's eyes. The other worked at the length of a clearing over open sights, with the chief of section standing where he could see the ground. The same men served both, and the drills for the second were taught and practiced like any other. By the evening of the 20th of March, the clearing had been lived in for a day and a half. The red dust of the dry season lay over everything in it, on the guns, on the sandbags, on the men filling the sandbags, and it lifted again wherever anything moved. Overhead there was open sky, which there was almost nowhere else in that part of the province. 100 meters out, on every side, stood the wall of the trees. Inside that circle were a full artillery battalion and an infantry battalion, and the infantry battalion was there less one company. In all, about 450 men held gold. That is not many for a place with that much artillery in it, and it was not meant to be. The guns were there to reach a long way out. The infantry was there so that the guns could. The infantry was Bender's, the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry. The artillery had a commander that day who was not its own. Vesey held the battalion as deputy commander of the division's artillery, and the record sets down those 2 words. That day, on purpose, the perimeter had been divided on the 19th and had not been redivided since. Company B had the eastern half of it, Company A the western. The brigade's other infantry battalion was not in the clearing at all. It had gone out to a night position a few kilometers to the northwest, which was the ordinary arrangement. A battalion working the country slept where the day's work had taken it, and came back when there was a reason. West of the base was the mechanized battalion, Julian's, with tanks attached to it that the Corps had found somewhere and handed over. It was not far away. Between it and the clearing ran a stream with banks too steep for the carriers to climb. And on the morning of the 19th, the brigade had flown in without it rather than wait for a crossing to be made. So the armor stayed on its own side of the water. 3 pieces of 1 brigade then, in 3 places. Guns and infantry in the clearing. Infantry a few kilometers to the northwest. Armor beyond the stream. Each of them was inside the other's artillery range, which on a map is a kind of touching. Work on the perimeter went quickly through the 20th. Depth is what a position gains on its 2nd day. The holes go down another foot. The parapets take another course of bags. The wire gets a second belt where the ground in front is open, and none of it looks like much from 1 hour to the next. 2 structures got the labor first, the command post and the fire direction center. Extra men had been flown out for that alone, to build those 2 bunkers and nothing else. And when the bunkers were finished, they went back to base camp on the next lift. It is a small piece of accounting, and it says plainly what those 2 holes were worth, compared with the rest. Around the guns themselves, a 2nd ring of fighting holes had been dug. Inside the infantry's ring, close in among the howitzers and the fire direction bunkers. That ring was standard, and that ring was empty. Nobody was posted to it, and nobody sat in it. It existed in case. On the 20th of March, men spent part of the day digging holes that nobody intended to occupy. The howitzers stood without their shields. The shields had been taken off to save weight, because a gun that travels under a helicopter is weighed before it is hooked up, and a plate of steel not carried is a load of ammunition, that is. Every gun in the clearing had come in by air. Not one of them had a shield on it. Fire from outside was part of the arrangement too. Bases like this one were sited within reach of other batteries, so that each could shoot the others close-in concentrations and answer the others' mortars. The clearing sat inside that web like every position in the operation. Plans for the 21st were made in the afternoon. Garth had been up in his helicopter over the ground north and west of the base and had seen an enemy force there, 30 to 40 men, as it counted from the air. Sweeps were ordered for the morning. 1 battalion would work north, another west, so the next day already had a shape. The infantry would go out of the clearing and walk. the guns would stay behind and shoot for them, and by evening, a party of 30 or 40 men would either have been found or would not. Nothing about that was unusual. The last thing done in daylight was a rehearsal. The battalion's reaction force, the reconnaissance platoon with men from the artillery battalion attached, was assembled, run through where it would form and how it would get where it was going, and released. The artillery kept 2 more parties of its own, 10 to 15 men each, for putting weight on the perimeter wherever weight was wanted. They formed, they moved, and they went back to what they had been doing before. After dark, the base put people outside itself. 2 ambush patrols went out through the wire, each a reinforced squad. 1 from each rifle company, 1 to the east and 1 to the west. In front of every platoon, a pair sat out in the grass as an observation and listening post. Everyone else was inside the holes, and the guns stood ready laid. The listening post reported movement on the perimeter that night, and reported it as heavy. Nothing came of it. That is an ordinary entry in an ordinary night's log in that country. Something was out there. It was close, and it did not come in. At 4:30, one of the patrols beyond the wire heard noise around its position and said so on the radio, and the battalion was brought up on the strength of that one report. Then minutes went by, and then hours, and nothing further was heard from anywhere. The men who had been woken went back to sleep, or did not. Half an hour before first light, the battalion stood to at full alert, the way the standing instructions said to, the way it had done every morning it had been in the field. When there was enough light to see the ground, the infantry went out and walked the clearing and the near edge of the trees, looking for anyone who might have come in during the dark. Dawn brought a kind of relief. The enemy seldom attacked a fortified position in daylight, and light in the clearing meant the night had gone the way most nights went. The sweep worked its way around toward the wood line. The dust had not begun to rise. At 6:30, the patrol east of the wire began to gather itself up to come in. It had been out all night. The light was up. There was nothing left for it to do out there. A minute later, the first mortar round came down inside the base. It landed on the doorstep of a company command post. Seconds behind it, a second round burst just outside the battalion headquarters. Then the rest of it came, for more than one bearing at once. And it did not stop. By the reckoning afterward, some 650 rounds fell. Not in a salvo, but over the whole span of what followed, while the men who had fired the first of them were walking in toward the base. The radio traffic with the patrol beyond the wire ended at 6:30. It had reported movement at 4:30, and it had reported nothing since. When the rounds began falling, it did not answer. The base was awake when it started. The morning alert had not been let down, and nobody had to be found or shaken out of sleep. The men were in their equipment and standing at their own sectors already. The brigade wrote afterward that this counted for more in the first minutes than anything else on the position. It was not caught getting up. Bender's infantrymen went into their holes. The howitzers in the clearing began firing high angle, at map locations where the mortars were thought to be. Not at anything that anyone had seen, but at the places from which that much fire could be coming. 5 minutes after the first round, the wood line opened. 2 battalions of the 272nd Regiment came out of the jungle on foot and started across the open ground toward the base, firing machine guns, rocket launchers, and rifles as they came. They did not come out at one point. They came out along the length of the trees. For a day and a half, the wood line had been the thing at the edge of the view. 100 meters off, the same in whichever direction a man turned, green and closed, and not particularly interesting. Now the whole of it was firing, and the 100 meters of red dirt in front of it was the only distance left in the world. The dust came up with every burst and hung where it was. The clearing had been cut open only days before, and the ground in it was still raw. Stumps, turned dirt, the felled trunks shoved out to the edges, and the rounds walked across that and lifted it. The men in the holes worked inside a red haze that never entirely settled between one round and the next. As the regiment closed, machine guns and recoilless rifles came into the fire from behind it, working the parapets and the gun pits. Within a very few minutes, the entire perimeter was under attack at once. The mortars kept falling the whole time, walking back and forth across the inside of the circle, on the guns and the bunkers and the open ground between them. The weight of it went on to the eastern half. Northeast and southeast were hit hardest. Company B's ground, the sector it had been handed on the 19th, and had been deepening ever since. The western half was under fire too. The fire on the east was of another order entirely. The 3 batteries in the clearing turned to counter-mortar work. This is artillery doing the thing it is built for, and doing it blind. A position is being shot at. The direction and the range of the shooting are computed from what can be heard and seen of it, and the guns answer a patch of forest that no one on the position has laid eyes on. The howitzers stayed at high angle. They were still artillery. Those mortars were not something the infantry had brought along with it. The regiment had an artillery element attached, a unit carrying a number and a designation of its own, and it had worked in support of this regiment's attacks before, at other bases, in other weeks. What came down into the clearing that morning was being fired by people whose whole trade that was. Fire from outside arrived almost at once. Batteries at other bases within range laid a belt of protective fire all the way around the clearing, close in, walking it along the outside of the perimeter where the ground was being crossed. One of those batteries fired nearly 1,100 rounds before the morning was over, and most of that in the first 20 minutes. 20 minutes is nothing, and it is a great deal. In 20 minutes, a battery shooting like that goes through the ammunition laid out beside the trails and starts on what is stacked behind, and the men serving it stop hearing anything but their own guns. Powder smoke stands in the pits without moving. The brass builds up underfoot faster than anyone can kick it clear. Just before 7, Garth ordered the rest of his force to Gold. Bender had told him what was standing on the perimeter. The brigade commander had 2 other pieces of his command out in the country that morning, and he sent them both. To the northwest was the other infantry battalion, on the night position it had walked to the evening before. To the west was the mechanized battalion with its tanks, on the far side of the stream. It had not been able to cross 2 days earlier. Neither of them was far away in kilometers. Both of them started. The battalion to the northwest took the warning order and formed up to move. As it formed, mortar rounds began falling on its own position, from an origin it could not identify at the time. One company went out immediately off the established trails, on the straightest line it could take through the jungle. The rest of the battalion came out behind it. In the clearing, the fire went on building. Everything the regiment had was in it now. The mortars from beyond the trees, the recoilless rifles and machine guns from the wood line itself, and the rifles of the men in the open ground, which came closer as they came. On the perimeter, the sound arrived as one sound, with the outgoing rounds of the base cut into it. There was no shortage of things to shoot at, and there was very little time to choose among them. The infantry in the holes fired at what was in front of its own sector and nowhere else. Because nowhere else was anyone's business, the gun crews worked their pieces at high angle on data passed to them from the fire direction bunker, and did not look out over the parapets. Nothing had come through the wire. The perimeter was 2 days old and had spent both of them getting deeper, and it was doing what a perimeter does, holding men below the level of the ground, facing outward, each with a piece of the circle to watch and no other. The belt of wire in front of the holes was intact along its whole length. The regiment crossed most of the open ground and stopped short of the wire. It went to ground in the folds of the plowed dirt and behind the stumps of a clearing that had been cut only days before. And there it made its final preparations to go in. Inside the perimeter, the guns kept firing over the heads of the men in the holes, out at places in the forest, at mortars that had not stopped. The order for help had gone out, and no help had arrived. The circle was still a circle, and the wood line, 100 meters out, was where all of it was coming from. At 7 in the morning, a light observation aircraft came over the clearing and began to circle it. It was the first American aircraft above gold that day. The fight had been going for half an hour by then, and until that minute, the sky over the base had been empty of everything except what was passing through it. The man flying the aircraft was a forward air controller, and he began at once to bring in strikes. Controllers did not live on fire support bases. They flew out of the forward base camps, along with the aerial artillery observers, which meant that above a base under attack there was nobody until somebody flew there. 200 men could be inside the wire of a place, and the air over them would stay empty until an aircraft arrived from somewhere else. One had now arrived. The work he did was done with smoke. A controller marked what he wanted, hit with a smoke rocket from a tube under his wing, and the jets came in on the mark. On the ground, the company commanders put out colored smoke of their own and told him where their men were in relation to it, and the strike was laid off that smoke by whatever distance they were willing to accept. At the same time, the guns of 2 neighboring fire support bases began to reach into the clearing. Their shells came down within 100 meters of the perimeter. That was the whole width of the open ground. From the wire to the trees was 100 meters, and the fire from outside was being put along the far edge of it, into the wood line the attack was coming out of. Bases were sited with that in mind. No fire support base stood farther from the next one than a howitzer could shoot, so that any base being attacked was inside somebody else's range and could ask. The distance between them was not chosen for the ground. It was chosen for the guns. Nor was the arrangement made on the morning it was wanted. When a new base went in, its artillery officers called across to the bases within reach and agreed in advance to fire for each other. Targets were picked and registered close in against each perimeter, and the firing data was written down and kept in the fire direction centers. When the call came, nothing had to be worked out from the beginning. The battery outside that carried most of that morning fired nearly 1,100 rounds in less than 4 hours, and most of them went out in the first 20 minutes. That is not a rate anybody decides on shell by shell. That is a plan that had been made some other week, running. A few minutes after the aircraft came on station, the southeast wind. Company B reported that its first platoon had been overrun and surrounded. In the company's own report, the attack is called a human wave attack, And that is the phrase that went up the net that morning, out of the holes to the battalion, and from the battalion into the record, where it has stayed. The base was a circle, and what was happening to it was that the circle was being pressed in at one place at a time. The pressure was never on all of it at once. It came against one arc, and the men on that arc gave ground or did not, and then it came against another arc, and the ring changed shape without breaking. A flight of F-5 fighters came in low over the trees, and on that side, the advance slowed. Behind them, strikes were called all the way along the wood line to the east, down its whole length, to take some of the weight off the company's part of the perimeter. While he was directing those strikes, the controller was shot down by heavy automatic weapons fire. It came from the ground in front of the base, from the same weapons that were firing into the wire, turned up. What became of him afterward is not written down anywhere. What is written down is what followed from it. The airstrikes stopped. For a while there was nothing over the clearing at all. The guns inside went on firing, and the guns outside went on firing, and the morning came back down to what was standing in the open ground, and what was in the trees, and to the 100 meters between them. Not long before 8, the commander of Company B asked the artillery to fire beehive into the southeastern and southern sections of his own perimeter. An infantry officer who asks for that is telling the gunners something precise, and they would have understood it immediately. He is telling them that in front of his sector there is no longer a line of his own. Minutes later, the same company reported that the penetration in the 1st Platoon sector was complete, and that it was running out of ammunition. 20 men and a load of ammunition were sent across from Company A. That was the reinforcement that reached the southeast that morning, and it was all of it. There were about 450 men in the clearing, and there were no others. Every man who went to the southeast came off some other part of the same circle. The battalion reaction force had already gone in. The reconnaissance platoon and gun crews from the artillery, sent out of the gun pits and onto the infantry line. The artillery kept 2 more groups of its own, 10 or 15 men each, held back for exactly this. Both of them were committed. By the middle of the morning, there was no one left in the clearing who was in reserve, and the base was being defended by moving the same men from the quiet side of the ring to the loud one. That reaction force had been rehearsed the evening before. Somebody had walked the men through it in the last of the light on the 20th. The signal, where to assemble, which route to take out to whichever part of the perimeter had called. In the morning, the assembly and the movement out both went quickly, and afterward the brigade wrote down that the rehearsal was the reason. At 13 minutes past 8, the northeastern section of the perimeter was overrun. Both of the places where the ring had been driven in were now on the eastern half of it, and the men still holding between them were being pushed back toward the middle of the clearing, where the guns were. 2 minutes later, a body of men came in through the wire from outside. They were from Company A, and they had spent the night lying in an ambush position beyond the perimeter, on the ground the attack had crossed. They got up, moved through the men who had the base surrounded, came in over their own wire, and took up positions on the line. Nowhere in the record is it explained how. The report says that they had somehow managed to get past the Viet Cong around the base, and it says that every one of them came in. It is the only time that morning that anybody entered the clearing from outside it. Just then, a second forward air controller arrived overhead with fighter bombers behind him. An Air Force liaison officer named Meyer, remembering it afterward, said there seemed to him to be 500 of them coming at him. That was a man's impression of a thing he was looking at, formed while he was looking at it, and it is nearly all that survives of what the morning looked like from inside. The strikes that came in behind the second controller stopped the second push. On that side of the ring, the ground in front of the holes stopped moving toward them. In the middle of the clearing, the guns were still working, and around the trails of each one, the empty cases were building up in the dirt where the crews had thrown them. The third place was the north. The commander of Company A reported that the Viet Cong had come through the northern sector of the perimeter, in his own area, and with that the ring had been driven in on 3 sides of itself, inside a little over an hour. Southeast, then northeast, then north. Each one held until it did not, and then the next one began. On that side of the base, dug down into a pit on the perimeter, stood a machine gun mount with 4 barrels on it. It was an anti-aircraft weapon. There was nothing in the sky over War Zone C that it had been built for, and it was there because 4 barrels laid flat at a wood line are worth having on a fire support base at night. Anti-tank rockets hit the mount and it was overrun. Men climbed onto it and began working to turn it around, to bring the 4 barrels off the trees and onto the inside of the base where everything was. 75 meters away, a howitzer crew had watched the whole of it from their own position, from the rockets coming in to the men getting up onto the mount. 75 meters is close enough to see what somebody's hands are doing. The crew laid their piece on the mount and fired 1 round into it, and the mount came apart, and nothing was turned around. The howitzers standing in that clearing had no shields on them. The shields had been taken off before the guns were flown in, because they were weight, and weight was the thing that decided how many lifts it took to put a battery on the ground. On the 21st, the guns were what the attack was aimed at, and they were being fired on with recoilless rifles and with rifles. Bender ordered the men on the east side back. They came off the outer holes and onto the line that ran around the gun positions, and the defended edge of the base stopped being the edge of the clearing and became a ring drawn close around the artillery. That line was not improvised while they walked to it. An inner perimeter was part of how a fire support base was laid out, and it was laid out for this. It gave the infantry a second position to fall back into. It put the gun crews into the fighting line beside them, with rifles, on the ground they were already standing on. And it did one more thing. A howitzer firing over open sights has to see what it is firing at, and it has to have nothing of its own standing in the way. As long as the infantry was out at the wire, the guns in the middle could not be used like that at all. The moment the infantry was behind them, they could. Direct fire did not become possible when somebody decided on it. It became possible when the line came back. The men who came back did not stand up among the guns. They got into the foxholes at the gun positions and got down inside them. Below the line, the barrels would be firing along. The order of it mattered. It could not be reversed. The infantry comes back first, and the tubes come down after. Then the tubes came down. Not all of them. By that hour it was the remaining howitzers, the ones that could still be worked, but along the arc where it was needed the gunners brought the barrels level, until each piece was pointing out across ground that its own crew had been standing on an hour before. The rounds were beehive and the fuses were set at muzzle action, which is to say that the round opened at the mouth of the barrel and not somewhere out in front of it. The reason written down for that setting is the plainest one in the record. The enemy was too close for any other. What a crew does at that range is the work it does at any range, and it is worth saying slowly, because it is what the middle of this morning actually consisted of. The gunner lays the piece, the breech takes the round. The fuse is set. The command is given and the gun fires and rolls back on its trail, and the case comes out, and the next round goes in. Then again, ammunition for a gun firing at that rate does not come from anywhere near the gun. It comes off a stack, by hand, a round at a time, from wherever it was put down when the base was built, and the ground between the stack and the piece was being crossed all morning by the same men who were now also the line. There was no elevation to crank on, and no data coming across from the fire direction bunker. There was no forward observer, because the crew was the observer. Everything the man laying the gun needed to know was in front of him, over the barrel, in the open, round after round, point blank, along a level line. The distances that morning came down like a set of steps, and each of them is a number somebody wrote in a report afterward. Airstrikes were being brought into within 50 meters of American positions, which required the men calling them to know where their own edge was exactly, and to say so. Outside the base, the neighboring batteries kept a ring of fire going all the way around the battalion perimeter, light guns and medium guns together, put down and held there. Inside the base, the Viet Cong had come to within 15 meters of the defensive positions and were still coming. Of the beehive round the brigade afterward wrote a single sentence with no adjective anywhere in it. It stopped everything in its path. In the same pages it wrote down the change it wanted. Beehive concentration should be worked out in advance for every howitzer and given target numbers, so that the infantry and the crews could ask for one by number, according to which piece of the perimeter needed it. The beehive ran out. The gun crews fired them until there were none left in the clearing, and more of them went down those barrels in that one morning than had been fired in any single action of the war up to that day. When there were no more, the guns went on firing high explosive at the same range, over the same open sights, level. Brass built up around the trails and had to be kicked clear. The clearing filled with burnt powder and with the red dust of the dry season, which came up off the ground with every round and was never given long enough to settle before the next one lifted it again. By 20 minutes to 9, the northeastern, the eastern, and the southeastern parts of the perimeter had all come back to the line around the guns. The northern, the western, and the southern sectors were where they had been since first light, and they were holding under a weight of fire that had not slackened anywhere. The base was a smaller thing than it had been at dawn. The ground the battalion held could be crossed in a few seconds at a walk, but it was one piece. Nothing had been cut off inside it. No part of the ring had been separated from any other part, and every sector still had men in it who were firing. What it was running out of was ammunition. The guns had gone through their beehive and were into high explosive. The infantry had been asking for resupply for the better part of an hour, and what had reached the worst of it was 20 men and what those 20 could carry. 30 rounds of beehive were fired inside that clearing, and then there were none left to fire. The crews went to high explosive and kept shooting at point-blank range. Nothing about the change was announced. What stood at the gun was what there was, and the men serving it counted what was left in the same way a man counts anything he is going to run out of, by looking at it, and then by looking at it again a few minutes later. Some of the ammunition on the position never got fired at all. Fire had reached part of it where it lay, and rounds had gone off among the pits. What was left had to be carried by hand from one gun to the next, across open ground, in the middle of everything else. The accounts written afterward use the word troubling about the supply, and that is a careful word for men who count rounds for a living. Close in, the weapon that did the most was the grenade launcher. Outside the wire, the ground was furrowed and folded, cut about by old work and by the morning's shelling, and men moving toward the clearing could keep inside those folds, where flat fire went over them. What reached them came down instead. The battery asked afterward for twice as many launchers and twice as many hand grenades. None of this was being done by the clearing alone. Batteries at other bases stood inside range of it and had been firing since the first minutes, putting their shells around the outside of the perimeter in a ring. The base could never have laid there itself. One of them alone put out close to 1,100 rounds, most of them early. From inside the wire, none of it could be told apart from anything else. Help had been ordered out long before any of this. When the first report of the attack reached Brigade, Garth turned the rest of his command toward gold, and the rest of his command was scattered through the woods on the day's own business. An infantry battalion to the northwest, a mechanized battalion to the west, and the tanks that had been attached to it. The battalion to the northwest was standing in formation, ready to march, when mortar rounds came into its perimeter. Where they came from was not established at the time. The battalion finished forming and went. That shelling is read in the brigade's own account as evidence of something. The enemy had located the battalion and had anticipated that it would try to come. But whatever had been put out to stop it had been put on the roads and on the established trails, on the ways a relieving column would ordinarily move. It was not in the heavy jungle. Nothing significantly delayed the advance. Company C moved out immediately, by the most direct line it could take and off the trails, and the remainder of the battalion followed behind it. There was sniper fire on the way, and there were mortar rounds, and there was no large force waiting. The most direct line ran through bamboo. Bamboo of that kind grows and stands with nothing between the stems. It does not part and it does not trample. It has to be cut, one stem at a time, by whoever is at the head of the column. Between the night position and the clearing, there were 1,500 meters of it. That is the distance the company cut, with the sound of the base ahead of them the whole way. Getting there was simpler than getting in. The base was firing outward on every side, and the arc the company would come through had to have its own fire moved off it first. The lead element had to be taken off the course it had been following while that was arranged. Coordinating the two was, in the language of the report, difficult. Then the company came through, under the covering fire of the men already inside, and took over the southwestern portion of the perimeter. The base had grown by a company. It went on being pushed everywhere else. West of the clearing, the second column had a different problem, and had had it since the evening before. Julian's mechanized battalion with the tanks had spent the night on the far side of a stream called Suoi Tre. Crossing it was already on the list for that day. The brigade's order had the battalion over the water and sweeping beyond it. The morning changed nothing except the hour it had to be done by. The stream was not wide. Its banks were the difficulty, and for a tracked vehicle, a bank is either a ramp or a wall. The column searched along it, and the search produced exactly one place worth trying. A stretch where the water ran out of sight underground, and the crossing could be made on the bed itself. They went over there and turned toward gold with the carriers in front, breaking trail. A tracked vehicle in that kind of jungle makes its own road and leaves it open behind for whatever follows. and the tanks came up the lane the carriers opened. From inside the base there was nothing of this to see. The last trees stood in the way. At 12 minutes past 9, the column came out of the jungle southwest of the clearing, through the last of those trees and into the open, and the sound of it went over the top of everything else in the morning. The vehicles turned along the outside of the line and worked their way around the perimeter, machine guns going, the tank guns firing canister. The ground shook where they passed. Whatever was still coming at the wire from that side now had the wall of that fire between it and the clearing. With the armor outside and the company on the southwest, the base had enough to move outward instead of inward. The units counterattacked to the east. Back across the ground, the eastern sectors had given up, and by the middle of the morning the perimeter stood where it had stood before daylight. The firing did not stop. It moved. It went from the wire out to the edge of the trees, and from the edge of the trees into the woods beyond, and the guns that had been shooting at 15 meters came up off their bellies and went back to shooting at range, which is what they were built for. By then the morning had turned hot. Dry season dust had been standing over the clearing since first light, thrown up by the guns and then by the tracks, and it came down on everything with the smell of burnt powder in it. Men who had been in the same holes since before daylight stayed in them a while longer. At 10 in the morning, helicopters came into the base. Of the guns in the clearing, all but one had been damaged. They stood where they had been set down on the 19th, in their ring, trails staked and brass banked around them, and the crews went along the line looking at sights and wheels and the marks on the barrels. Past the wire, the ground ran flat and open for 100 meters, and then the trees started again, the way they had the morning before. The 272nd Regiment went out to the northeast, scattered and out of order, and the artillery and the aircraft stayed on the routes it was using for as long as it was on them. It had come to the clearing as a regiment. It left the way a regiment leaves when it has stopped being handled as one, in groups, by whatever ways were open. Of the regiments in that division, the 272nd was reckoned the best organized and the best equipped, and it was one of the very few enemy units that would attack in daylight at all. That is the whole of what needs saying about how it fought at the clearing. It came on in the morning, in the open, and went on coming for hours. What it left behind on the ground was mostly ammunition. Nearly 600 rounds for anti-tank rocket launchers were collected in and around the clearing, along with some 1,900 grenades, and something on the order of 28,000 rounds for small arms. Over 50 of the launchers themselves were picked up. That is not what a unit carries to a chance meeting. It is what a unit puts in place beforehand. Documents found in the area said the same thing in writing. Intensive planning had been done before the attack, and the attacking force was named in them, the 272nd Regiment of the 9th Viet Cong Division, reinforced by elements of the U-80 artillery. 2 days earlier, the same ground had given up charges laid under a landing zone with wire running back into the trees. Both ends of that week say one thing: the clearing had been chosen by both sides. American dead on the 21st of March numbered 31. The figure stands in the reports without comment, in the place where such figures stand, on a line of its own. In May, the 9th Division left South Vietnam altogether and crossed into Cambodia to be rebuilt. Documents taken later showed that several of its battalion commanders and political officers had been relieved for how their units had performed during the operation. The division had come south to fight for a season and had spent the season being fought. Papers from the enemy's headquarters for the south carried something more specific, and it is the plainest measure of the morning that exists. For the next 6 months, units were directed to avoid attacks of regimental size and to take objectives that smaller forces could take. Through the rains that followed, what came instead were short attacks by fire and raids that did not stay. The instruction was written by the side that had made the attack. For the 21st of March, the brigade received the Presidential Unit Citation. Some things were done differently afterward, and the account set them down as practice rather than as judgment. Preparatory fire put into a landing zone before a lift came in began to include bombs with instantaneous fuses, laid on the exact ground the helicopters would touch, to cut wires running back from buried charges. They had to do it without tearing the ground up so badly that nothing could land on it. The officer who wrote the Army's account of the operation records the change and dates it to that March. The howitzer shields came back. They had been taken off to save weight for air movement, and after the 21st, the weight was found somewhere else, in equipment that could be left behind instead. One lift went out with the shields on and gave no trouble, and that settled it. Fire plans changed as well. Concentrations were plotted within 30 meters of a unit's own wire, with closer ones worked out and held on call, so that no one would be working the numbers out while they were needed. Firing data for the beehive round was prepared in advance for every gun on a position. A sector could then ask for it by number, in 3 words. Instead of describing what was happening, ammunition stopped being kept in one place. It was broken up among the gun positions and put under overhead cover, because during an attack a man cannot cross a position to a storage point, and because fire had reached the stocks at Gold. The batteries were given twice the grenades and twice the launchers they had carried before. The brigade's own summing up is the flattest page in the file. Apart from some techniques in the use of the beehive round, it says, there were no new or startling lessons learned as a result of the Battle of Suoi Tre. What it puts in place of a lesson is a list, pre-planning, rehearsal, prepared positions, and training good enough that every man can do the job he was given. The artillery's reaction force had rehearsed its part the evening before. Junction City went on without the clearing. Phase 2 of the operation closed on the 15th of April. The brigade held Tay Ninh and the road south of it and worked the lower western half of War Zone C, and on the 20th of April, it ended its part in the operation and went back to the ordinary business of the province. A third phase was not in the original design. The first 2 had gone well enough that another was ordered, and it was given to the 25th Infantry Division to run alone, with a brigade committed to it, and a tank company, and a battalion of South Vietnamese Rangers attached. For 20 days those forces moved through the same forest, and the organized units they were looking for became almost impossible to find. Most of what they met were small groups. Bunkers and structures were found and destroyed, and what losses there were came mostly from mines and from traps left in the ground. It became evident that the enemy had gone somewhere else. An operation of that size is added up when it finishes, and Junction City was added up in objects. 100 crew-served weapons were taken and 491 individual ones. More than 5,000 bunkers and military structures were destroyed across the zone, which is a number that says less about fighting than about how long people had been living in that forest and how well. Then there was what the forest had been holding for them. Over 800 tons of rice came out of it, and close to 40 tons of salt and dried fish and the rest. Nearly 500,000 pages of assorted documents were carried away. The paperwork of an organization that had been running in there for 20 years and kept records like any other. At midnight on the 14th of May, Junction City was brought to a close. It had been the largest offensive operation of the war to that time, and it ended on a date at an hour with nothing in front of it. The battle got its name afterward. No one in the clearing on the 21st called it anything. They were on a fire support base with a color for a name, holding a perimeter, and the perimeter was the whole of the geography that mattered. Suoi Tre was a hamlet a short way off, abandoned before any of this, empty on the morning of the battle, and empty after it. The day needed to be called something, and it was given the name of the nearest place where no one lived. The clearing closed. That is what clearings do on that land if nobody comes back to keep them open. The wire went slack and then went under. The gun pits held water, and then held silt, and then held roots. The bare red ground that 400 men had scraped and filled and stacked in a single day and a night went green again within a season or two. The way a scratch closes on a living thing, somewhere under it there is still the shape of a circle. Above it there is only forest, level and unremarkable, the same flat canopy that runs for kilometers in every direction and gives the eye nothing to hold on to. And the shape of the thing, if you want one, is this. A very large operation was built that spring on a simple idea. Put enough battalions around a forest, and whatever is inside it will have to come out and fight. 22 battalions were written into the plan. A horseshoe was drawn on a map, and deception operations were run beforehand not to lead the enemy away from it but to walk him gently into it. And the enemy declined. He was not inside the horseshoe when it closed, or not in the numbers anyone had hoped for, and the great encircling arms shut on jungle. What happened instead was smaller and stranger. Having refused to be surrounded, he began to come, at his own hours, to the small, isolated places the operation had to put out into the forest in order to work at all. A firebase is a solution to a problem. You cannot walk infantry into deep jungle without guns in range of them. So you cut a hole, fly the guns in, and dig. But a hole in the forest with guns in it is also a target. And it is a target that announces itself, and it cannot move. 3 times in 3 weeks that spring, the men in the trees walked up to one of those holes in the dark and came through the wire at first light. So the operation did find its battle, not by closing on anything, by standing still in one place long enough to be found. The horseshoe caught nothing. The clearing caught everything, which leaves the guns. A field artillery battalion exists to shoot at what it cannot see. For men it will never meet. Over ground it will never walk. Its whole craft is distance, aiming stakes and firing charts and corrections, called in over a radio by somebody a long way off. For a few hours on one morning in March, all of that was set aside, and the crews did the one thing the whole apparatus is designed to make unnecessary. They dropped the tubes level and fired at what was in front of them. That is the part that stayed in the manuals. Not the operation, not the horseshoe, not the plan. Just the fact that it can come to that, and that men who had trained for the far target were able, without much time to think about it, to serve their pieces at no distance at all. The forest has all of it now. The trails, the pits, the wire, the road the tracks broke through the bamboo, the ford where a stream ran underground and led an armored column across. Season after season it has been quietly taking those things back, and it has nearly finished. A bamboo stand cut through by hand closes in a couple of years. A lane broken by tracked vehicles takes a little longer, because the ground under it was pressed flat, but it closes too. Nothing out there was built to last, and nothing out there was meant to be found again. It is a flat country, and that is most of what there is to say about it. No ridge to hold, no river line, no town worth a name. Just green going away in every direction under a sky that whitens by mid-morning, and here and there a bare patch where somebody once needed one. The war in that province was largely a matter of making such patches, holding them a little while, and leaving. This one was held for a few weeks, and for one morning of that it was the loudest place in the country, and then it was nothing again. The mountain that stands alone out on the plain is still standing there, visible for 50 kilometers, the way it was visible to everyone on both sides that spring, and for a very long time before. Let it be quiet now for you as well. Sleep well. The long watch will be here tomorrow night.